All right, I think we're live. Welcome to the Synergetic Livestream number 10 on August 22nd, 2021. Today in the Synergetic Livestream number 10, the spirit today is differentiate and integrate, related to this integrator chain idea and learning. Today in 10, we're going to go over some of the key memes and themes and things to integrate, and then go into several sections of text. First, we're going to talk about the book Cosmography a little bit, and then recap some of the history, tracing back from Synergetics to other ideas like Transcendentalism. Then there'll be one slide on structure, and then a section on 935, Octahedron as conservation and annihilation model. So to restart with some of the key memes and themes, Synergetics is relational and multi-scale thinking. It's connected to our direct experiences. There's a sense of finiteness, and there's no infinitesimals or infinitely large things, or points, lines, and planes, at least understood in the traditional sense. Synergetics is framing design as a process of anticipatory cybernetic science, and this is something that we'll explore today. Is there's this relationship between tensegrity and physical applications of tension and compression architecture with Synergetics, which is kind of like an even more generalized set of principles, or at least ways to play around conceptually before building it physically. And that's in a way like the relationship between engineering and physics. There's also this idea that space has a shape, and that's going to be explored in the close packings today as well. And the sense of structure, static or dynamic structure with triangle as the basic unit of structure. Universe is the total scenario, and system means any specified subsystem, which means it's going to have an inside and outside, therefore shape. The minimum number of units, energy events that make up a system is going to be 4. And this idea of 4 also comes up not just when talking about tetrahedra, but also thinking about 4-dimensional, 4D time lock, that's this shape. A tetrahedral focus, which has 4 sides, not a square focus, which has also 4 sides in 2 dimensions. And then also there's other senses of 4D, which we'll be talking about soon. Nothing's really changed on the things to integrate, but if people have any suggestions, they can let me know. All right, the first topic is cosmography. So this is a book that was, according to the introduction, was mostly written before Bucky's physical death or whatever in 1983. Then it was revised over the following years and published in 1992 with Kiyoshi Kuromiya as the adjuvant, which is drawing on a notion from immunology to sensitize the immune system or to carry along. And this is an awesome book. This is just one of the figures. This is figure 2.1, tetrahedra. Nice, very clean tetrahedra. And also, it sounds like Kiyoshi Kuromiya was a very interesting person, so there was a lot of things to research and learn about here. Also, before we kind of dip into these figures, this is from the ebook that was transformed by Brett Elmendorf. So thanks to Brett for making this ebook accessible. Just to pull out a few kind of cool figures from Cosmography. Here in figure 2.7, there is the caption. This represents the 3 great circle-spun square planes exactly bisecting the tetrahedra in 3 symmetric ways. Note the primary tetrahedron and the secondary internal octahedron, so the big tet and then the inscribed octahedron. And only then are the implied square cross-sections of the octahedron apparent as tertiary derivations of the primary structural system, which is the tetrahedron. There is no single plane, omni equal angle, equal edge square structural integrity in universe. Squares and cubes are always and only tertiary derivations of prime vectorial structuring systems. So this is kind of an implicit pot shot against the Cartesian XYZ cubic Minecraft reality, pixel reality, voxel reality, because he's basically showing that you get cubic subdivisions of space or cubic measurements and coordination inside of the symmetry of the octahedron, which can be seen as being one-to-one coexisting with a specific tetrahedron. Like for every defined tetrahedron, there's a specific octahedron that's inscribed within it and vice versa. So the fact that they come into coexistence at the same time, you can therefore take a tet first approach and see the cubic lattice as arising as sort of a downstream consequence of choosing a tetrahedral coordination for your first move, instead of saying that your primary coordinate system is going to be cubic, because I'm not sure all of the reasons, but one of them is there is no structural stability in the cubic arrangement of oranges in a cube. They would always shift back down to kind of crunch into a close packing. And there's other maybe reasons too, but that's kind of an interesting figure. And it's related to the fact that there's 6 edges in a tetrahedron and that there's 6 vertices in the octahedron. So then this is from this George Hart website. This is a consequence of the fact that an octahedron can be inscribed in a tetrahedron. The 6 edge midpoints of the tetrahedron are the 6 vertices of the octahedron. The octahedron in this image is the intersection of the 2 components of the stella octangula. So pretty cool, shows a lot, and again, that's a interesting thought that you can get cubic coordination out of a tet system, but it's hard to get clean tets out of a cubic system. Here's a few pages later in Cosmography on figure 6.3. It's called Macro Micro Systems Diagram, and it says, in Synergetics, the always and only experientially based geometry of conceptualizing and thinking, I discover, first, that all experienceable somethings, be they apples, cows, thoughts, clouds, are systems. And so the starting place is 3, the specifically relevant tuned-in system. So for the retina, it's 400 to 700 nanometers of light, or whatever it happens to be. This is like the censoring bound that is detectable of a given antenna or biological apparatus or sensor, or spatial scale that can be seen by a telescope or a microscope. And then there's the macro twilight and the micro twilight. And that, again, is sort of like things that are outside the field of vision of the scope, or it's kind of like too disciplinary versus too general. And in both the micro and the macro twilights, that's where there's the zone of proximal information gain, where there's tantalizingly possible relevance. It could be significance, but the false positive or false negative rate might be very high, just like twilight visually. And then 1 and 5 are like, again, relative to the defined system, macro irrelevant, untuned in universe, and micro irrelevant universe. So things that are too fast or too slow to be picked up in the measurement fall outside of this band. And so there could be important processes happening at both these scales, and it's an interesting question how we deal with that. 6.4 shows a tetrahedron reflecting a minimum system with an insideness and outsideness. And so 3, even though the triangle is the unit of structural stability, it turns out that 3 is still kind of not yet in existence because it doesn't have space enclosure yet. So it can be conceptualized, and you can think about a triangle, but it can't exist as a coherent system in any physical instantiation. And there are no parts or elements independent of systems. A system always divides all universe into these 10 intercomplementary but distinctly different component categories. And they're just written here. I'm not going to read them, but they relate to what happens when you go kind of from 0 to 1 system. All of the insideness and outsideness relationships multiplied by this sort of micro and macro perspective is related to what these points are in 6.4. And then this is a pretty interesting figure 6.13. The 3 ways of physically demonstrating the simplest system in universe. The 4-vertexion. The tetrahedron, the tetravertexion, or 4-vertexion, can be tetrahedron being 4 sides, so why not call it 4 vertex to emphasize that we're not just interested in the faces, but in the vertexes, can be equally validly drawn as 1, the Platonic solid emphasizing the 4 faces, which alternatively are known in synergetics as divergent openings. So that's sort of classical Platonic tetrahedral solid. That's the face-centered approach. 2, the 6 lines or edges, which alternatively are known in synergetics as vectors. So that's sort of an edge-first approach. And then 3, the vertex domains, which alternatively are known in synergetics as closest packing of spheres. And that's related to this 4-6-4 FEV relationship of the tet. And so you can think about the tet as sort of like a block, as well as a wireframe, as well as closed pack spheres. All right, that is it for cosmography. So let me just mute this. Okay, so on to transcendentalism. Okay, so the story kind of begins here with Margaret Fuller, Bucky's great aunt, and the publication, The Dial. So here's The Dial magazine, and it was written about The Dial. The Dial's editors were Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller, as well as frequent contributors such as Henry David Thoreau, Bronson Alcott, etc., etc. And to read something from, I believe, the New Yorker piece, the conversations that here Margaret Fuller hosted in Boston between 1839 and 1844 have been called collectively the first consciousness-raising group. By this time, Emerson had formed the intellectual society that came to be known as the Transcendental Club. The transcendence he espoused was a rejection of established religion in favor of a romantic creed in which faith was one thing with science, with beauty, and with joy. A soul liberated from blind obedience to Christian dogma would be free to follow its own dictates and to seek a direct experience of divinity in art and nature. The transcendental gospel suffused Fuller's conversation, but in a more heretical form. She was encouraging women to become free agents not only in relation to a deity, but in relations with men. So not sure about all the details on that, but I found that pretty interesting about Bucky's great aunt, Margaret Fuller. And to kind of rephrase this relationship and then maybe explore some of the commonalities, whether by coincidence or direct cultural transmission. So this is from Kirby Erner's blog from this February 21 post. There's also a certain geometry Fuller developed, which we might teach as part of literature, since he mostly used prose for it. American Transcendentalism. His great aunt Fuller, Margaret Fuller, was likewise a feminist and a first editor of The Dial, which first published Emerson and Thoreau. So this is kind of mentioning synergetics by and by on the road downstream of what Margaret et al. Were thinking at this period in time. So a few quotes from Margaret Fuller. I'll just uncrop something on the screen for a second. Okay. So she said, one short quote that was really popular online: today a reader, tomorrow a leader. And then 2 slightly longer quotes that I think presage a lot of what Bucky wrote about and thought. So the one on the left says, all around us lies what we neither understand nor use. Our capacities, our instincts for this, our present sphere, are but half developed. Let us confine ourselves to that till the lesson be learned. Let us be completely natural before we trouble ourselves with the supernatural. So that relates to what Bucky talked about in terms of just down here with the donut. This is sort of what we neither can understand nor use, those wavelengths that are above or below the sensor's range. So there's this thread in Bucky of developing our ability to perceive or to model faster and slower and different phenomena that we can't directly build, and then kind of being in feedback with building. And then there's this idea of direct versus indirect perception. And then an interesting tension that's in not direct opposition, but just kind of juxtaposition is that there's this sense of there's more out there than we can directly apprehend. But then there's this sense that direct apprehension is the most important thing. So that's whether that's operationalism and thinking that action is the most important part rather than knowledge of our existence. How do we meld these two ideas that we have a prior that we only can experience a small amount, yet we prioritize the experience part? How do we balance the part that we know might be larger, but we don't directly see? Then here's another quote by Margaret Fuller. She said, "Male and female represent the two sides of the great radical dualism, but in fact they are perpetually passing into one another. Fluid hardens to solid, solid rushes to fluid." So that relates to maybe some ideas like the jitterbug and phase transitions and some of the thermodynamics aspect of how the shapes are connected to each other. Another synergetics relationship is how the tetrahedra itself can't tessellate space, but it can co-tessellate. And also the kind of qualitative quote, "Unity is plural and at minimum two." So some kind of ideas from her work and colleagues. So kind of one visual on that was seeing Transcendentalism as a sort of bundle of threads that came together at a specific time. And there's probably other ways to make this with things coming off to the side, but we can trace that transcendentalist insight, American and otherwise, in theology, metaphysics, philosophy, visual art, and writing, specific communities, experiences, one of the branches with geometry and synergetics, and maybe other stuff. And then also, just to close this section, this was from an email that Kirby sent on August 20th, but I thought it was really insightful. So he wrote, "My project has been to link a partially overlapping contemporary of mine, Bucky Fuller, the futurist and dome guy, back to Transcendentalism. Not only for his relationship to Margaret, grandnephew, nor just for his New England/Harvard type upbringing, Bear Island, but for his no more secondhand God, which I'd categorize as a transcendentalist classic, if conventions will let me. It's philosophical, as is his more formalized Synergetics. 2 volumes, Macmillan, with Ed Applewhite, a collaborator. I'm well versed enough in STEM, honors calc at Princeton, full-time math teacher in the 1980s, to be able to synchronize a high school humanities curriculum, where we study this transcendentalist stuff, to a high school mathematics curriculum that's ahead of the pack and anticipates the mainstream of the future. The Bucky stuff is included on the STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, side of the C.P. Snow chasm, twixt STEM and humanities, as well as the path side, philosophy, anthropology, theater, history, and in fact provides our chasm scanning bridge." So just to catch those up who might not be familiar with the C.P. Snow, this is from a blog posted here. "The term two cultures has become a shorthand in certain academic circles for the differences between two attitudes. The phrase has lived on as a vague popular shorthand for the rift, a matter of incomprehension tinged with hostility, that has grown up between scientists and literary intellectuals in the modern world. This polarization of perspective certainly was a factor in latter 20th century academia." So I remember hearing that in Silicon Valley as the techie and the fuzzy. And inside and outside of academia, what cultures are divided? It's not just that one dimension. So how do we think about tensegrity for the physical bridges, like this sort of compression and tension device that this fellow is sitting on, bridging the microscope and the philosopher, and then also think about synergetics as being a common structure for some of the conceptual connections that we want to make across fields. Okay, for now a single slide on structure. So this is section 600 in Synergetics. So structure, definition, structure. A structure is a self-stabilizing energy event complex. A structure is a system of dynamically stabilized, self-interfering, and thus self-localizing and recentering, inherently regenerative constellar association of a minimum set of 4 energy events. 3. Stability means angular invariability. Inherent means behavioral principles that man discovers to be reliably operative under given conditions always and anywhere in the universe. Regenerative means local energy pattern conservation. Constellar means an aggregation of enduring, cosmically isolated, locally co-occurring events dynamically maintaining their interpositioning, e.g. macro constellations such as the Big Dipper, Orion, and the Southern Cross, and micro constellations such as matter in general, granite, cheese, flesh, water, and atomic nuclei. So just to kind of give a quick recap on what systems perspectives might be like in Synergetics versus hearing about systems perspectives outside of Synergetics. On the left side, it looks kind of like a system diagram that one might see amongst just 6 relationships being drawn amongst 4 nodes. Those are the 4 circles of different sides. And so these 4 nodes, as they are on the left side here, you could think about them as being arranged on a 1 or 2 dimensional space. Like they all happen to be on a line. So maybe they're the height of 4 different collaborators, and then the size is their, ability of some skill. Or it could be just that they happen to be out there, but also they could vary in some other way. But this is a common representation that you might see in the areas of topology, network and graph theory, systems diagrams, like social networks, flowcharts, and other areas. So when we go into Synergetics framing, Synergetics shows the same 4 nodes of 4 different sides, and it's the same 6 relationships. So it turns out that it wasn't just a coincidence. For example, if there was other structures, then it wouldn't be consistent as a synergetic minimum system because it couldn't be physically implementable. But when we put the 4 in a geometric arrangement rather than just in a happenstance, like force-directed way on the page, we get the idea of vectors, edges, and geometry. So changes through time, dynamics, and shape, and making things consistent with the shape of space. There's this tension and compression element, which isn't inherent in just the undirected or directed graph framing. There's this notion of embodiment because there's a physical interpretation given for events, then there can be physical subsystem. Then there's this sort of trim tab, sense-making, cybernetic element that can be introduced. Again, also can be worked in here. And then also some of these other cool things that Synergetics brings to the table. So that's kind of what system is when you have inside and outsideness split by 4 energy events. Okay, now to a section on Octahedron. So this kind of interlude is from 935 to 938, Annihilation scenario. This is section 935, Octahedron as conservation and annihilation model. And so just to show what shapes come into play, here's a tetrahedron, cube, octahedron. So it's sort of the Egyptian pyramid with a square base and then 4 triangular sides and 2 equal ones that are base to base. Kind of like the Ethereum logo. Okay. So not going to read every single section in this whole piece, but mainly the yellow highlighted sections. So in 12. Until the 20th century, scientists in general assumed the light of all the stars to be instantaneously and simultaneously extant. Universe was an instantaneous and simultaneous system. The mid-19th century development of thermodynamics, and in particular its second law, introduced the concept that all systems always lose energy and do so in an ever-increasingly disorderly and expansive ways. The academicians spontaneously interpreted the instantaneity and simultaneity of universe as requiring that the universe too must be categorized as a system. The academicians assumed that as a system, universe itself must be losing energy in increasingly expansive and disorderly ways. Any expenditure of energy by humans on Earth, to whom the stars in the heavens were so much just romantic scenery, no more, no less, would hasten the end of the universe. This concept was the foundation of classical conservatism, economic, political, and philosophical. Those who spent energy were abhorred. 13. This viewpoint was fortified by all the 100 years earlier concept of classical science's giant, Isaac Newton, who in his first law of motion stated that all bodies persist in a state of rest or in a line of motion except as affected by other bodies. This law posits a cosmic norm of at rest. Change is abnormal. This viewpoint as yet persists in all the graphic chart coordinates used by society today for plotting performance magnitudes against a time background, wherein the baseline of no change is the norm. Change is taken spontaneously as being inherently abnormal and is as yet interpreted by many as being cause for fundamental social concern. 14. With the accurate measurement in 1887 of the speed of light in vacuum, science had comprehensively new, experimentally redemonstrable challenges to its cosmogony and cosmology. Inspired by the combined discoveries of the Brownian movement, blackbody radiation, and the photon of light, Einstein, Planck, and others recognized that energy as radiation has a top speed, ergo is finitely terminal. So here was just some kind of interesting Bucky takes on quantum, and he starts off by taking some of the big developments in 20th century physics and is going to give a new take on them, I guess. And interesting to tie to this change is good, change is bad, progressivism versus conservatism. Lots of ways to read it, but that's what Bucky wrote. 15. Boltzmann's concept was analogous to that upon which was developed the theory and practice of the 20th century meteorological weather forecasting, which recognizes that our terrestrial atmosphere's plurality of high-pressure areas are being progressively exhausted at different rates by a plurality of neighboring low-pressure areas, which accumulate atmospheric molecules and energy until they, in turn, become new high-pressure areas, which are next to be progressively exhausted by other newly initiated low-pressure areas. The interpatterning of the various exporting centers always changes kaleidoscopically because of varying speeds of moisture formation or precipitation, speeds and direction of travel, and local thermal conditions. So cool to think about in the weather rainstorm case, but also in the metaphysical, like idea precipitation case. Also on here, this idea that change is going to be abnormal and that the graph, has the flat line for 0, and then we want the GDP to be above 0, or we want it to be in a certain range. Instead of one way to read this idea of change being bad is that when our preference or our expectation is linear, then non-linearities are worrying, but because of there's non-linearities in nature, so we want to have a model that expects closer to how things actually will develop, because then we'll be less surprised, we'll be able to have better control. So back to 16. Though they did not say it that way, the 20th century leaders of scientific thinking inferred that physical universe is apparently eternally regenerative. Einstein assumed hypothetically that energies given off omnidirectionally with the ever-increasing disorder of entropy by all the stars were being anti-entropically imported, sorted, and accumulated in various other elsewheres. He showed that when radiant energy interferes with itself, it can, and probably does, tie itself precessionally into local and orderly knots. Einstein must have noted that on Earth, children do not disintegrate entropically, but multiply their hydrocarbon molecules in an orderly fashion. Little saplings grow in an orderly way to become big trees. Einstein assumed Earthian biology to be reverse entropy. This account does not presume to recapitulate the actual thought processes of Einstein at any given point in the development of his philosophy. Rather, it attempts to illustrate some of the inevitable conclusions that derive from his premises. So this is awesome, this kind of Bucky disclaimer saying, yeah, this is not, this is historical fiction or allegory or parable given an unpacking of some distillation. It's just an interesting way to tell history and provide sense making about what ideas were held by what people when. and why. And then 18. What made it difficult for scientists, cosmologists, and cosmogonists to comprehend about Boltzmann's concept or Einstein's implicit espousal of it was the inherent discontinuity of energy events implicit in the photon as closed system package of energy. What happened to the energy when it disappeared? For disappear it did. How could it reappear elsewhere in a discontinuous system? So this section really ties onto a lot of ideas in synergetics related to like this radical discreteness and finiteness and inactive and embodiedness to theory. The discreteness and the finiteness arises because there's nothing that's infinitely small and there's nothing that's infinitely big, especially when we're talking about just system, which is always specifically defined. So that's why there's so much emphasis on minimal space enclosing system, because any real event has to actually enclose space. There's this idea of simultaneous order arising from and becoming and unbecoming with disorder, and ways that local areas of organization are sort of like a Turing reaction diffusion machine, or like some sort of other inference network, like some sort of reactive Forney factor graph, that these areas are just sharing information, message passing, or source sync in ecology, and that order or meta community dynamics or overall patterns are arising from that relationship. And that's this idea of the multiple nested or fractal layers of import-export dynamics, again, informational or thermal. And then of all the possible exchange schemes for these nested areas, whether they're continuous or discrete, there's the question about how are the specific parameters for the subset of these systems that's regenerative and sustainable, diversifying, resilient, and anti-entropic or negentropic, like basically a living system. And this tradition goes back a long time, but it goes back to Schrodinger's 1944 pamphlet, What is Life? The Physicist's Approach to the Subject, with an epilogue on determinism and free will. So what Schrodinger kind of asks in this question-oriented paper, What is Life? And comes to these two really important principles, which is the locally negentropic, so locally organizing or resisting dissipation, and therefore entailing some like cybernetic and good regulator and predictive elements. That's going a little bit beyond what he mentioned, but basically, regardless of how we interpret it from a strategy or game theory perspective, there's a local organization occurring. And then there's also this section on the use of aperiodic quasi-crystals as part of a physical, thermal, and informational maintenance scheme. This, I think, is not a closed book, this whole discussion, what is life and how do we measure it and such, but one area people could look into if they were interested is this 2018 paper from Ramstead, Badcock, and Friston, answering Schrodinger's question of free energy formulation, and then some of the papers since 2018. It's just a cool area of literature. So I'm going to take those properties that came up on the previous slide and think about how the idea of precession, which is about forces acting at a 90-degree angle, how those relate to quanta. So section 935.21. One quantum of energy always consists of 6 energy vectors, each being a combined push-pull positive-negative force. See section 600, that's why we did 600, through 612, and figure 620.06. 12 unique forces, 6 plus and 6 minus. 6 vectors break into 2 sets of 3 each. Classical engineers assumed that each action had its equal and opposite reaction at 180 degrees. But since the discovery of the speed of light and the understanding of non-simultaneity, we find that every action has not only a reaction, but also a resultant. Neither the reaction nor the resultant are angularly opposite in the 180-degree azimuth from the direction of action. The equal and opposite of classical engineering meant that both action and reaction occurred in opposite directions in the same straight line in the same geometrical plane. But since the recognition of non-simultaneity and the speed of light, it has been seen that action, reaction, and resultant vectors react omnidirectionally and precessionally at angles other than 180 degrees. See figure 511.20. So here's 511.20. One energy event: action, reaction, and resultant. One energy as demonstrated by the man jumping from the boat. His action demonstrates the action, reaction, resultant of the open-ended triangular spiral. All right, so let's make it bigger. So here's one way that a person is going to, an energy event, or a photon jumping between layers, or maybe a bit flipping or something like that, depending on which way the boats are pointing. If the boats are pointing the same direction, then when the person jumps from the other boat, this back part is going to be pushed that way, and then of this boat, it's going to drift this way. And so then it ends up with the resultant actually coming back to be moving, if they both had motors, let's say, to be pointing at the same pointing vector as the reaction. And then in this case, when the boat that the person's jumping to is already kind of pre-aligned with the direction of action, in which case the resultant diverges from the reaction. So the fundamental piece here is that it's not just like billiard balls that are constrained to just operate in a single line, or like Newton's cradle that just clips one way or the other, and then it kind of everything changes when it gets out of alignment. There's multiple geometries for the action, reaction, resultant, aka the problem, reaction, solution trio. So depending on the scenario, the way that two events or two systems interact doesn't have to be linear. So this is kind of like complexity in chaos theory. And this might be something we talked about another time, but just to kind of only read the highlighted sections here. There's these two sets of three vectors that are going to make up a tetrahedron are likened to the proton and the neutron. And so there's some other sections that talk about that more, but let's just consider them the teams for now. So the proton's three-vector team consists of the action vector, the reaction vector, and the resultant vector. The neutron's three-vector team consists of the action vector, the reaction vector, and the resultant vector. And these are likened or concorded to some of the different subatomic particles. Either one of these two teams of three-vector events is identified in quantum mechanics as being a half quantum, or 1/2 spin, or 1/2 Planck's constant. When two half quanta associate, they produce one unit of quantum. See section 240.65. These two sets of three vectors each combine to produce the 6 vector edges of the tetrahedron, which is the minimum structural system of universe. One quantum of energy thus becomes structurally and systematically conceptual. See figure 935.23. One quantum of energy equals one tetrahedron. Humanist writers and broadcasters take notice that science has regained conceptuality. Science's intertransformabilities and intercomplementarities are modelably demonstrable. The centuries-long chasm that has separated science and the humanities has vanished. So here's the figure showing some subatomic events and just the way that, I guess, mainstream non-synergetics physics frames these different particles or patterns, and then the way that it's in figure 935.23. And pretty cool how it maps onto the TET. But just to kind of continue on that last thought about the humanities and the sciences. 24. The tetrahedral model of the quantum as the minimum structural system of universe is a prime component in producing the conceptual bridge to span the vast chasm identified by C.P. Snow as having for so long existed between the 1% of the world people who are scientists and the 99% of humanity, comprehendingly communicated with by the writers in literature and the humanities. This chasm has been inadvertently sustained by the use of an exclusively mathematical language of abstract equations on the part of scientists, thus utterly frustrating the comprehension of the scientists' work by the 99% of humanity that does not communicate mathematically. This book, Synergetics, contains the conceptualizing adequate to the chasm bridging task, and it does so in vectorially structured geometry and in exclusive low-order prime numbers in rational whole number accounting. As an instance of chasm spanning between science and the humanities by conceptually transformative energy quanta accounting, Synergetics conceptually elucidates the Boltzmann import-export, entropy-syntropy transaction, and the elegant manner in which nature accommodates the hidden ball play of now you see it, now you don't, energy transference. So, this is Bucky's take on that CP-SNO divide that Kirby was talking about earlier, or later, depending on how you think about it. But that's neither here nor there. He's directly saying that Synergetics is the bridge between these worlds, which Bucky had a slightly different phrasing on, and many different takes existed online. And just the way that Bucky thinks Synergetics is going to relate to building this bridge was related to what Kirby said about it's primarily in prose. There's more paragraphs in Synergetics and graphics than there are equations. There are some kind of mathematical equations, and there's some tables with underlying math, and there's all this secondary computer science and math that's been developed, but the book itself is primarily prose and graphical, experiential maybe. And he says that Synergetics is up to the task through two contributions. And I'm sure these were distilled down, which is that it structures vectors with geometry. So this is vectors like forces and through time dynamics. So time and geometry, space. And it's going to be the space of nature with the close sphere packing and the tetrahedral coordination and the minimum of 4 making a space enclosing system rather than an XYZ Minecraft voxel world. And then the other half of the contribution is to focus exclusively on low order prime numbers in rational whole number accounting. So the low order primes like 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, etc. And the rational whole number accounting being no kind of like infinite decimals or physical systems that don't come down to specific integer-based math. And the integer math and the numerology just goes in so many different directions. So that's a whole nother direction. The indigs and everything. 25 is talking about how the quanta and this idea of there being a minimum packet of energy that comes into existence with all these features like the charge and the spin, but never just one, never just the charge or just the spin. The way that potentially there's mappings in the humanities, like the nature of message passing or of like communication, where how does meaning move between two different entities? And that's this hidden ball play of now you see it, now you don't, energy transference. And so most people don't communicate mathematically. They want to read a novel or experience a narrative of some technology like a podcast or a movie about a romance or something rather than try to make a mathematical model of romance, which I know there's some people who are totally into. And then quantum has kind of proceeded mathematically. There hasn't been, in Bucky's opinion, enough kind of communication broadly of some of the fundamental, to him, exciting developments in physics and what they mean for our perception of reality. So then 936, volumetric variability with topological constancy. So topology, the connectedness of things, is going to stay the same, but there's going to be changes in the space enclosing volume. 10. Symmetrical and asymmetrical contraction. 11. An octahedron consists of 12 vector edges and 2 units of quantum and has a volume of 4 when the tetrahedron is taken as unity. See table 223.64. Pulling 2 ends of a rope in opposite directions makes the rope's girth contract precessionally in a plane 90 degrees to the axis of purposeful tensing. Section 1054.61. Or if we push together the opposite sides of a gelatinous mass or a pneumatic pillow, the gelatinous mass or the pneumatic pillow swells tensively outward in a plane at 90 degrees to the line of our purposeful compressing. This 90-degree reaction or resultant is characteristic of precession. So this is connecting the idea of, for example, braided things like a rope. When they're pulled under tension or pushed under compression, they have a different width. And even like DNA has A and B DNA and cDNA, all these different isoforms. So I wonder how that works with DNA. 12. The octahedron represents the most commonly occurring crystallographic conformation in nature. See figures 931.10 and 1054.40. It is the most typical association of energy as matter. It is at the heart of such association. Any focused emphasis in the gravitational pull of the rest of the universe upon the octahedron's symmetry precesses it into asymmetrical deformation in a plane at 90 degrees to the axis of the exaggerated pulling. This forces one of the 12 edge vectors of the octahedron to rotate at 90 degrees. If we think of the octahedron's 3 xyz axes and its 6 vertices, oriented in such a manner that x is the north pole and x prime is the south pole, the other 4 vertexes, yz, y prime, z prime, all occur in the plane of and define the octahedron's equator. The effective gravitational pull upon the octahedron will make one of the 4 equatorial vectors disengage from its 2 adjacent equatorial vertices, thereafter to rotate 90 degrees and then rejoin its 2 ends with the north pole and south pole vertexes. See figure 936.12, color plate 6. Here's that figure of 936.12, octahedron as conservation and annihilation model. If we think of the octahedron as defined by the interconnections of the 6 closest packed spheres, gravitational pull can make one of the 4 equatorial vectors disengage from its 2 adjacent equatorial vertexes to rotate 90 degrees and rejoin in the north and south vertexes in the transformation completed as at 1. So this is a sort of way that we again draw upon the parallel earlier between the close packing of spheres and the vertex-oriented view. We could think of it as a tetravert with 4 energy events. We could think of it as having 6 edges or 4 faces, or we could think about the centers of the vertexes being equally separated and therefore equivalent to this kind of close packing. And that's what motivated the whole desire to use the close packing of spheres as our fundamental coordinate system rather than, again, the Minecraft voxel world. And what's being shown here is a transformation where when you have the sort of expanded form of the rope, so here it's been pushed, or depending on how you think about it, it's been opened up. And then when there's a compression from one side or the other, there's a change in the packing of the spheres. And that is going to be associated with a volumetric change, which we'll hear about. So here's the same figure. 13. When this precessional transformation is complete, we have the same topological inventories of 6 vertexes, 8 exterior triangular faces, and 12 vector edges as we had before in the symmetrical octahedron. But in the process, the symmetrical 4 tetrahedra quanta volume octahedron has been transformed into 3 tetrahedra, 3 quanta volume, arranged in an arc section of an electromagnetic wave conformation, with each of the 2 end tetrahedra being face bonded to the center tetrahedra. See section 982.73. So there's a transformation that puts the higher volume, lower energy configuration, and then transforms it down from the A to down on the bottom right, is the transformation is completed. And then there's 3 tetrahedra that now exist in this transformation. And so where does the volume go? 14. The precessional effect has been to rearrange the energy vectors themselves in such a way that we have gone from the volume 4 quanta of the symmetrical octahedron. Again, that's inscribed inside of a tet, so we can still have a tet first view on this octahedron. The volume 4 quanta of the symmetrical octahedron to the volume 3 quanta of the asymmetric tetra-arc array segment of an electromagnetic wave pattern. Symmetric matter has been entropically transformed into asymmetric and directionally focused radiation. one quantum of energy has seemingly disappeared. When the radiation impinges interferingly with any other energy event in universe, precession recurs, and the 3-quantum electromagnetic wave retransforms syntropically into the 4-quantum octahedron of energy as matter, and vice versa, QED. See figure 936.14. So QED, what can you really say about that? And we'll go to the figure in a second. The octahedron goes from a volume of 4 to a volume of 3 as one tensor is precessed at 90 degrees. This is a demonstration in terms of tension and compression of how energy can disappear and reappear. The process is reversible, like Boltzmann's law and like the operation of syntropy and entropy. The lost tetrahedron can reappear and become symmetrical in its optimum form as a ball-bearing sphere octahedron. There are 6 great circles doubled up in the octahedron. Compression is radiational, it reappears. Out of the fundamental 4-ness of all systems, we have a model of how 4 can become 3 in the octahedron conservation and annihilation model. So that's sort of the story arc of the conservation and annihilation, is we're going to approach this from a shape of space and prose-driven perspective rather than potentially some sort of quantum geometry perspective, mathematical topology or something in that genre. So we justified the way that rope or other structures could be precessionally changed in structure, related that to the shape of space, and that was prose driven. So here is where we get to the a figure that kind of is a fun little way to end this stream, because it was just a little bit of a rabbit hole, but an interesting discussion. And if anyone has thoughts about what this Iceland spar example really means, or any other take on it, it'd be kind of cool to hear. So, 16. See the Iceland spar crystals for the octahedron's double vector edge image. The interior volume of the concave vector equilibrium shaped space occurring interiorly between the 6 uniradius octahedral collection of closest packed spheres is greater than is the concave octahedrally shaped space occurring interiorly between the 4 uniradial tetrahedral collection of closest packed spheres, which tetrahedral collection constitutes the minimum structural event in universe, and its interior space is the minimum interior space producible within the interstices of the closest packed uniradius spheres. So, figure 936.16, it's no, it's not an Andy Warhol painting, it's the Iceland spar crystal. So this was just like, what an interesting image. 1 line of text on either side, and then 2 lines of text. So I started researching a little bit about this Iceland spar. So this is from the Wikipedia article. It's written, it has been speculated that the sunstone, Old Norse Solarstein, a different mineral from the gem quality sunstone, mentioned in medieval Icelandic texts was Iceland spar, and that the Vikings used its light polarizing property to tell the direction of the sun on cloudy days for navigational purposes. The polarization of sunlight in the Arctic can be detected, and the direction of sun identified to within a few degrees in both cloudy and twilight conditions using the sunstone and the naked eye. The process involves moving the stone across the visual field to reveal a yellow entoptic pattern on the fovea of the eye, probably Heidinger's brush. The recovery of an Icelandic spar sunstone from an Elizabethan ship which sank in 1592 off of Alderney suggests that this navigational technology may have persisted after the invention of the magnetic compass. So that's kind of interesting, and then looked up this entoptic phenomena within and visual effects whose source is within the eye itself. So there's a bunch of different categories of these. And then this Heidinger's brush was a fun piece that ties a lot of it together. So what is this Heidinger's brush? Also from the Wikipedia. Many people are able to perceive polarization of light, just like bees do. Heidinger's brushes may be seen as a yellowish horizontal bar or bow tie shape, with fuzzy ends, hence the name brush, visible in the center of the visual field against the blue sky viewed while facing away from the sun or on any bright background. It typically occupies 3 to 5 degrees of vision about twice or three times the width of one's thumb held at arm's length. The direction of light polarization is perpendicular to the yellow bar, i.e. vertical if the bar is horizontal. Fainter bluish or purplish areas may be visible between the yellow brushes, see illustration. Heidinger's brush may also be seen by looking at a white area on many LCD flat panel computer screens due to the polarization effect of the display, in which case it is often diagonal. So not sure how well this is going to come across on the stream, but pretty interesting to look at that pattern. Maybe there's other patterns that people see. And then it was citing to this 2021 paper, Seeing Polarization of Light with the Naked Eye, O'Shea, in, current biology. And they wrote, many readers may know that scores of animal species sense the polarization of light for purposes including navigation, predation, and communication. It is commonly thought that humans lack any sensitivity to polarization of light. We hope to convince you otherwise by describing 3 examples where humans can detect polarization of light with the naked eye, by showing you how to see it yourself, and by describing its uses. So to kind of tie it back to synergetics, what does this Heidinger's brush phenomena show us about human perception? What about when this sort of perceptive event is confirmed by sensor measurements and designed experiments? What does the phenomena show us about nature? What does it mean about the structure of light that it has polarization? Like, could there be a world where light doesn't have polarization? Or why is polarization always in only the states that it is? Or why is it co-varying? Or why does it have certain causal implementation on or effect on some other system? Are there only 2 ways it can be polarized? So, and then again, thinking about the history and the name of the Iceland spar crystal and some of its reputed uses, and then also kind of tying it back to the modern technology, the modern scrying screens, and then just it's giving us polarized light. The sun is polarized, but in a different way, and it's providing information to us. And just because we might not see it, it doesn't mean that it's not influencing us. And then, what does this all have to do with synergetics? And there's probably a lot of answers, so it'd be fun if people have thoughts. But one way to think about it is that it's a story and a phenomena that's right at the intersection of our perception, our experiential world, our cognition, and our action. And it ties together, like Kirby outlined, the stem and the path, like the techie and the fuzzy, the physics and the math, and the history and the philosophy. Because, again, one of the ideas raised earlier was this tension between the primacy of experience, but then the recognition that experience was just a tiny fraction. So these phenomena, like Heidinger's brush, which can then be experimentally confirmed. For example, maybe people were just aware that this rock could be used a certain way, and you'd have a certain sense or a certain sight that would help you. And then when we have the spectrometer, we can measure it hundreds of years later. But phenomena like this sit right at the twilight zone of the informational foraging that actually suggests at the deeper structure of nature. So in a way, this is sort of a middle path or some sort of problem reaction solution to that dialectic of experience is primal and the most important and the only direct apprehension available to us, yet it's so partial. And it in a way relates to the earlier slide from Cosmography about us existing at a specifically relevant tuned in level with our generative modeling and our perceptive process, with our active inference, and then conceptually, similarly. And then there being just an above and a below that goes beyond our understanding, yet has implications for how we act while we can. So I hope this was a fun .10. The goal was to go over some of the early chapters, just a few random figures in Cosmography, but it's a pretty chill book. Give a first pass on Transcendentalism and Synergetics with a nod towards Kirby's awesome blog series. and then a quick recap on structure, and then from the TET, we thought about space packings and the octahedron and the way it could go from a 3 to 4 volume and absorb and emit energy, giving a qualitative and a geometric interpretation of quantum or quantum events in a way that comes from the prose side and the aesthetic and the structure and the system side. And is at the very least compatible or hopefully sort of in a leapfrog or jitterbug relationship with other approaches. All right. Thanks for watching. I hope this was interesting. Leave a comment or send a message if you have any suggestions or anything, but thanks and bye.